Hey everybody, it's been a minute. I know I said that I would get this out on Friday, but things have been pretty busy. I think we are very close to reaching picture lock with Creative Force, the Ukraine documentary. I am very pleased with how it came out. I came back from Notre Dame and the 60-minute was good, but then I had to focus back on the 90-minute version, so I took a few weeks to really flesh that out. It was already assembled, but there was a couple of extra scenes that I really wanted to add, and I added them in, and I think those worked out really nicely. I also had to get some translations done for a couple of scenes and get some translations fixed. What I did to actually translate the movie from Ukrainian to English was just use a program called Mac Whisper. You can just put in audio and it'll transcribe it to lots of different languages, which you can then export as subtitles. So that's what I did. But obviously it's AI, so it's close but not complete. So there's somebody who I met a while ago. His name is Max Balter. He fled Ukraine during the outbreak of the war, and he lives here in Los Angeles, and he just looked at it and just fixed some translations, but also just gave some extra context, which made some scenes that we were covering all the more awful once you have the full context of what's happening. But in any case, we're really close to coming to picture lock. We have some finishing to do, and then we're looking at trying to get it into festivals and talking to some distributors, and we're looking at starting our initial run in Europe because that is where we feel as though it will have the most impact, because the fear is, and it's a well-warranted fear, that if Ukraine is to fall, then the rest of Europe could be next for a Russian invasion. And speaking of that, kind of segues nicely into this week's topic, which is what's happening here stateside, which is an outsourcing of creativity. Now, I'm going to focus on the film industry, but I think this goes into all creative, not just industries, but practices overall. And what I would like to do is actually take us back to some film history lessons. There was a time before, during, and after the Russian Revolution of 1917, when Lenin and the communists took power and overthrew the Tsar. And around that time, there were a lot of great filmmakers. The reason why we have editing is because of Russia. They were doing a lot of experiments during the beginnings when film was just getting started. And one of the experiments was what we now know as editing. They took a shot of a man, a shot of a bowl of soup, and I think there was a shot of a baby, where they put them all together and everybody had different stories. And then there was the movie Battleship Potemkin, and that's where modern editing started. And there were a lot of great, not just Lenin, but there were a lot of great thinkers and artists and filmmakers around this time. And as the years went on, as the communist government was taken over by Stalin and became a more repressive government, you saw a lot of those artists, and not only artists, but also scientists, anybody who was a creative thinker, try and leave the country. Over the next few decades, you just saw this giant brain drain leaving towards the West, to the United States, to Europe, so much so that where Russia was once known as being this place of great artistry and creativity, one of the hubs of it, you had authors like Dostoevsky and Kafka. Now that's really no longer the case. Now, I'm sure there are lots of creative people that are in the country of Russia, but we don't get to hear about them because it's become such an oppressive regime. Even with the downfall of the Soviet Union, they're under Putin right now, so it's even just as repressive, just in a different way. So we don't get exposure to, and there's not really a championing of creative thought, outside of the box thinking. It's been tamped down, and I'm seeing, or at least to me, it seems like we're at the beginnings of that here in the United States. Not just with the current presidency, but just because of the way that our tech industry and the film industry and just creative industries in general, there's just been this slow squeezing of creative people and creative thinkers. We don't have the means of supporting ourselves on a great level, really. So there's not really a lot of financing of risk anymore. Like the amount of, especially in the film industry, the people that are allowed to take risks has become fewer and fewer. You look at the big studios now versus what they would be more akin to take more risks. Now, this doesn't mean that they were just making art films all over the place. They certainly weren't. But there was this understanding that for every large blockbuster we do, the best thing that we can also do is keep on taking risks, tell human stories in order to make sure that there's a variety. They understand that the business itself and art itself is risky because you're dealing with lots of different people coming into a room and they're each going to have their own interpretation of it. So there's essentially no way to plan for that. So you just try and take a bunch of little risks. You have one big one, and the big one could pay off and hit big, but at least the little ones, it'll end up averaging itself out. And after the 2008 crash, there was a marked effort to not only get away from that because one, they felt as though actors had too much power and actors couldn't really be controlled, and individuals had too much power. Let's just put it that way. Individuals, whether they be actors or directors or producers, had too much power, and they want to consolidate that back into the corporate system. And they started getting taken over by, this was the beginning of streaming, and tech companies were on the rise, and this is the situation that we have now. It is right now very financially difficult to take a big risk. There's only a few companies that are really doing it, and some of those companies aren't really even making it. They're distributing it, but they're not making it. Companies like A24 and Neon. A24 makes more of their own movies than they do distribute them, but Neon really is just a distributor. So if you are making a movie that's going to be somewhat risky, let's take The Substance, for example. Now that is a very risky movie, and they had to go get private equity. That means individual investors to pay for the movie, and then Neon liked it and bought it. Now, so you have to be very lucky, essentially. And I think if that is to continue, and also with the backlash against DEI, there just seems to be more and more championing of homogeneity, at least in the traditional media sphere. Now, the digital sphere is different. That's where you get outside voices, but that's not really where you go for narrative stories, at least not at the moment. And narrative stories are expensive to make. And as of right now, we're used to them looking a certain way and having a certain quality. So there's only a few people that are really trained to do that at a really high level. And there might be more coming on the way, but that has not made its way into YouTube or any digital platforms yet. So as this gets more and more difficult, and as we're seeing a government that seems to be more and more repressive, what I'm concerned with seeing is that two things. One, risk taking is going to be more difficult and also harder to finance. So you'll just go someplace else, which is exactly what happened in Russia during the early part of the 20th century. Because we're seeing more international markets enter America, they're more akin to take risk and do things that are outside the box and creative. This doesn't mean that this is all they do. Every country with their own media has the same things that we have here for entertainment. They have big action movies, horror movies, reality TV, game shows, talk shows, all of that. But there is more of an appetite overseas. And when I say overseas, I'm talking about Europe, parts of Asia. Some governments may be more repressive than others. They value that there needs to be creativity for creativity's sake. They value having an educated population, a population that is encouraged, at least on somewhat of a level, to think. So in that sense, they are more willing to have funding go to art programs that make things that are what we would call outside of the box. if that's the case, if you were a filmmaker in the United States and you had the option, would you try and stay in the United States in the coming years where it's more difficult, or would you try and go over to Europe where it would be easier, especially if you're a drama filmmaker? You would probably try to see, how can I go to Europe? Or you would just do something else. And also, by that same token, if there is more of, and we're already seeing this not only with actors, but also directors. If you think about a lot of the directors that are famous nowadays, a lot of them are not from the United States. There's less and less of them in the United States. You have Denis Villeneuve, who's from, I think, Canada. The director of The Substance is not from the United States. So you'll probably just see more and more training of filmmakers outside of the United States. So the industry that we as a country really helped to put on the map, we are not training the next generation. We are not nurturing it. We're not harnessing new talent. So that talent is going to come from elsewhere. So we are essentially outsourcing the creativity to other places. And also with things like AI, companies really think that AI can do all of the thinking for you, and they're trying to put it in as many things as possible. And also long uses of AI I was just reading an article today about how it makes your ability to think creatively worse the longer that you use it. So not only are we not financially incentivizing filmmakers and creatives to use their creative skills, we're also, because we're trying to jam AI into everything, we are essentially dumbing our population, making them less creative and have less of an ability to think on their feet and to find creative solutions, which that is where all art and creativity comes from, is just to find solutions to problems. So if we're not going to be training the next generation of creatives, if we're not going to encourage creative thought and creative expression, and if we're going to try and outsource creative thinking to machinery, and therefore the upcoming generations of the population aren't able to think on their own, which ironically is what they say will help people who use AI, is by having critical thinking and soft skills. So if in order to use the machine, you have to have skills that the machine is taking away, that's disaster loop. What then is to come for the American way of thinking? Are we going to become just a nation of people who can't really think for themselves, and the heights that we once reached as far as like science and creativity are just going to be less, and we're just going to let somebody else take that over? I don't know what the future holds, but that essentially is what we're doing now. We are right now shooting ourselves in the foot. I'm not sure for what purpose, and I'm not sure how it's going to work out. But if these patterns continue, America will not be the place to be in order to have your creative dreams fulfilled. Or even more than that, one of the things about Los Angeles and why people, especially in the film industry, want to come here is because this is where some of the best are, especially in a place like Los Angeles. Everybody is trying to be in this industry. Not everybody, but if you want to be in this industry, this and New York are the places where you want to go, and you're around people who want to do the same thing. So if that no longer becomes the case, or if that becomes less, then our competitive advantage is gone. And we just make things that are mediocre, and we're not really looked at as the leader anymore, which I think would be a real shame, because again, the industry as we know it was created here in this country and in the place where I live, Los Angeles. Now, I am all for allowing other countries to have their films and television come here to the United States. I think the more exposure to our ideas, the better. I just think that it is a shame that a place like here, where so many people of all different kinds live and exchange ideas, that would then be lost. I think that would be a great loss if all the voices here became homogenous and not as creative and not allowed to express themselves like they were once before. Now, that is the worst case scenario. I know a lot of people, including myself, don't want to see that happen and will fight tooth and nail to make sure that doesn't happen. But we have a very long road ahead of us if we don't want to see that happen. I think filmmakers like myself have recognized this already. We just have to start making the stories that we want to see on our own. We have to do this on an independent level. And independent means maybe scaling our budgets back a little bit, and we're really trying to build a connective relationship with our audience, really trying to build a community around it. Because we've given up our agency and power in order to have some advantage of making a ton of money, and maybe there is still a ton of money to be made. But I think we have to think more of ourselves as storytellers and stop trying to aim for the big piece of the monetary pie and just trying to keep pushing steadily forwards. Even though he makes movies that I don't really particularly like, Tyler Perry is a great model for this because he decided to just keep going on his own. And even though he wasn't making a ton of money, he just went and made sure that he owned everything that he did. And I think we should follow in that same suit. So that's all I got for this week. Sorry I was late, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.